Good afternoon. Close to lunch. Good afternoon, everybody. I was sat down the front, actually, and I was just looking at this banner here from Computer World, and it's quite interesting. Computer World's areas of expertise: end-user computing, virtualization and cloud, Microsoft technologies, wireless networking, unified comms and collaboration. I think, hopefully, by the time I finish my 10 minutes, you'll realize that everything I'm talking about and everything that I've been talking to Barry and the Computer World team about recently is about bringing all of those things together. And no longer do we talk about just end-user computing or just cloud technology or just collaboration. It's about how do we bring those things together. I'm going to talk to you about end-user computing. I'm going to talk to you about how, for instance, we are delivering our workspace to people. I think we just saw some very interesting trends about how people's work is changing. What's interesting to me as well is how businesses are requiring more from us in IT. We're being told to spend more on digital transformation. Show of hands who's heard that buzzword before. And arguably, one of the challenges that we've got is that we are still spending far too much time spending time and money on what we used to do and perhaps not looking at new technology, and that's a challenge. And so I'm going to talk to you about how we have been delivering the workspace to the workplace to the workforce for some time. Back in 1999, I was, for my sins, in telemarketing. I apologize. I may well have called you at some point, but I was actively calling organizations and trying to sell them a technology back then called Citrix. And back then, there was really two ways we would deploy end-user computing. We'd either give people a PC, or you'd get a phone call from me, and I might try and sell you something called Citrix, which obviously was more around terminal services and server-based computing. But fundamentally, and what's worrying, is that actually the way in which we've been doing things for a while hasn't changed. I've just jumped ahead some slides. Because typically, when we're delivering the workplace and the workspace to our users, we typically still focus on these devices, putting Windows out on the endpoint and delivering it via a piece of hardware. And unfortunately, as many of you in the room will know, is that comes with some challenges. We have to make sure that all of our endpoints are patched. We need to make sure that we protect against ransomware and endpoint security concerns. We need to make sure that our user productivity isn't affected when Windows decides that it needs an update or we need to roll out a new application. And if you take a look back through this timeline, hopefully there are some logos in here that some of you might remember. But we seem to have gone through this churn, this Intel Microsoft churn of every time we need to deploy a new operating system, we need to deploy new hardware. And in fact, if you look at where we are today, because of things like Windows 10 as a service and the fact that Windows is being updated so regularly, we're now having to spend even more time on end-user computing, which doesn't seem to make a great deal of sense to me. And that's changing the way we do our migrations. It means we need to move from a traditional project-based migration every 2, 3, 5 years to something that's more business as usual. And arguably, as Barry has highlighted, that is one of the reasons that people are now extending or considering and deploying virtual desktop infrastructure. And people are doing that because it is easier to manage, it's easier to update, it's easier to secure, it's easier to enable remote working, for instance. Security and regulation, BYOD, call centers, organization, acquisitions. There's a whole ton of reasons why desktop virtualization and using things like VMware Horizon View make a lot of sense. However, up until recently, there has been two key ways of doing that. On the left-hand side, you've either taken a Windows server, enabled terminal services, and done Windows Server virtualization, multi-session, but everyone's ultimately logging on to a 2012, 2016, 19 server. Or, in more recent years, people have been deploying Windows 10 as traditional VDI, a one-to-one relationship between the user and their virtualized desktop. Sadly, what we haven't had is the best of both worlds. And what was quite interesting last year was that Microsoft announced something called Windows Virtual Desktop. Windows Virtual Desktop actually brings the benefits of those two technologies or two methodologies together. it allows us to consume Windows 10 multi-session from the cloud. At Ignite 2-3 weeks ago, Microsoft actually announced that this product is now GA and that everybody is now able to start to utilize this technology. It's been in the tech preview for some time. But the real interesting thing here is that not only can I now go to Microsoft and get a service, which removes some of the headache of having an on-prem VDI infrastructure, but more importantly, because it is multi-session, it is actually significantly cheaper to run in the cloud than ever before. Windows 10, Windows Virtual Desktop sits right in the middle here. We can have multiple users logging on. We can support things like our universal applications. It is also optimized for things like Office 365. If you haven't looked into Windows Virtual Desktop, then there are a number of sources online. Microsoft Mechanics is a very good one. Alternatively, go and speak to Barry and the team here at Computer World. One of the things that you get built into Windows Virtual Desktop is support for FS Logics and also support for Microsoft Teams. Coming back to that collaboration and communication that we're talking about, making sure that these new technologies like Teams are supported on Windows Virtual Desktop and making sure that we can do things like app attach and that we can deal with profile management in these environments as well. Lots of people have come to me, though, and said, well, I've got VMware, I've got Citrix. Is WVD just an alternative? Is the product going to be mature enough? I would ask you to stop thinking in that way, and I would ask you to start thinking about WVD in a slightly different way. Windows Virtual Desktop is not about the technology, but about the way it is licensed. The way in which we have historically deployed VDI, whether it be on-prem or in the cloud, has involved infrastructure, it's involved cows. In some cases, it has involved a one-to-one relationship between the machine and the user. With Windows Virtual Desktop, all of that cost is removed. And in fact, this isn't about replacing VMware or Citrix as your VDI vendor of choice. This is about changing how you license and adopt Microsoft Windows as a desktop. Significantly cheaper than what we've ever seen in the 20-25 years that I've been in this market. In terms of entitlement, a lot of this information is publicly available, but if you've got a Microsoft E3, E5, 365 Business, you're already entitled to utilize some of this technology, and the only thing you're going to be paying for is your Azure credits. The other thing that is going to drive some of Windows Virtual Desktop adoption is if you are still on Windows 7, then Microsoft will allow you to run Windows 7 in Windows Virtual Desktop infrastructure for 3 years without having to pay for any additional support. So that actually is driving some organizations and helping them overcome the challenge that is imminent come January 2020. VMware, Citrix, they both add value on top of Windows Virtual Desktop. All of the profile management, all of the image management, all of the application layering that goes with it still continues to add value. And you'll see Citrix and Microsoft, to be fair, adding value on top of Windows Virtual Desktop. Just proving that point again, that it's not an alternative, but just a different way to consume things. One of the other partners that Microsoft have been working with is IGEL, of which I work for. And at Ignite the other week, we announced, or Microsoft announced, that IGEL was the go-to partner when running Linux on the endpoint, accessing Windows Virtual Desktop. Let me say that again. Microsoft are supporting Linux on the endpoint when accessing a Windows Virtual Desktop, because they also see the benefits of perhaps utilizing and deploying Windows differently and from the cloud, and perhaps simplifying what we need to do on the endpoint. And so for that reason, we are outside today. We talk about something we call the next generation operating system for cloud workspaces. That basically is a very simple Linux operating system that runs on your existing endpoints and can convert your existing endpoints. It's purpose-built, very easy to manage. Tens of thousands of endpoints can be managed, purpose-built and secure to connect into any of those on-prem or cloud-delivered VDI desktop as a service workspaces, including VMware, including Windows Virtual Desktop, and including VMware on top of Windows Virtual Desktop. So if you want some more information on that, or you'd like some more information on Windows Virtual Desktop, obviously you can speak to Computer World. I'd recommend anybody to go and check out Microsoft Mechanics on YouTube. There's loads of great videos and content being posted on there. Or if you're interested in IGEL, you can go to igel.com/WVD and you can learn more there. But ultimately, I believe the way we deploy Windows in the future is going to rapidly change, not necessarily because of the technology, not necessarily because it is cheaper, easier to manage and more secure, but because it has become more cost effective to consume Windows in the cloud and have Linux on the endpoint. Thank you very much. Cheers.